So let's start with some CPR fundamentals, and we'll start with the definition of a continuing property record. Continuing property record, or a CPR, is the detailed records that support and document the fixed assets recorded in your general ledger. And what they are is just a record and a backup that proves what you own when you acquired it or built it and what you paid for it. So CPRs are that historical cost record for each unit of property. And when we talk about that, we'll talk about a CPR for poles, maybe poles by size, overhead conductor, underground conductor, fixed assets such as your office building, computer systems, fleet, and tools and things of that nature. So there are cost records for every unit of property that you have in your organization, your utility, or co-op. CPRs are the support for the general ledger balances. So if I summed up the total of your poles that you have in account 364 in the CPRs, in theory, they should equal your general ledger. Not always the case, but in theory, that's what should happen. They are also the source data for retirement calculations. So if you retire a pole that was placed in service in the year 2000, you look back at the record for the year 2000, that's the cost that you retire your assets at. So fixed assets are retired at historical cost. CPRs are the foundation for cost of service studies. I mentioned in the last module how where you place things in the general ledger determine how they are allocated in a cost of service study, and the CPRs help support that. And they are required documentation for many rate cases. So if you're a regulated utility, in many cases, you have to have this type of documentation for your rate cases, or if you're required by the state commission to undergo a depreciation study, you also have to have accurate continuing property records. That's what CPRs are, but what they are not are engineering design records. So what happens is that your engineering department, or consultants if you outsource that process, will design the project that you have to provide service to your customers. So say you have a line extension that includes 10 poles, 10 spans of wire, and all the associated parts that go with. Well, the engineering design for that will be very specific and very detailed. Where on the accounting side, we just need to know that 10 poles were put in, 10 spans of wire, and you lump all those costs together. That's your continuing property records. So CPRs are not engineering design records. They are also not maintenance records. CPRs are not maintenance histories. They are just the value of the assets that you placed into service in the year that you placed them into service. They are not asset condition assessments. They are not geographic information systems. You have other software tools for that. And they do not assist with real-time asset tracking. You have other systems for that. The CPRs are the historical cost of the assets that you placed into service. Although they don't exist in isolation, they connect to multiple critical systems that you have in your financials of your utility or co-op. They tie directly into the general ledger. The CPR totals by FERC account must match the general ledger plant and service balance. If I add up the total CPRs of account 364, poles, towers, and fixtures, I should get the balance of that in the general ledger. And they provide that cost of service backup, as we said, depreciation. CPR vintage data drives accurate depreciation calculations for each asset class. When you do a depreciation study, you look at the makeup of your fixed assets, your CPRs that are in service, to determine what the appropriate depreciation rate is for those fixed assets. The assist in retirement accounting, they are the record that you use to retire assets that are taken out of service. In many cases, there are regulatory issues for that. If you're a regulated utility by a state commission, by FERC, by RUS, that are used in supporting rate filings or depreciation studies. And for financial audits, your financial auditors may test the accuracy of your CPRs and completeness to determine that what you have placed into service supports the balances on your general ledger. Now, every CPR has 4 essential data elements. They should have these 4 pieces of information. This is all you need for a continuing property record. First off, what is it? The unit of property should be a specific, clear description of what the asset is, specific enough to identify the asset, but general enough to avoid creating thousands of unique records. When it comes to CPRs, less is more. You'd like to know about the distribution poles or class 2 40-foot or wood poles or steel poles, not a specific pole number on a specific street. That's for your GIS records. Number 2 is what we call the vintage, and the vintage is the year they were installed, the year the asset was placed into service. So this is critical for depreciation studies, but even more so for finding the historical cost of that asset when it was placed into service. Then the cost, the actual or average historical cost of the unit. This can be actual cost if known for what we call non-mass units of property. If you took our work order class, you know that a non-mass unit is something that is specifically identifiable. But for mass units, which are interchangeable, homogeneous, like poles, overhead conductor, underground conductor, meters, transformers, there you use the average cost of all the additions for a particular year, and that's reflected in the continuing property records. And then finally, the 4th element is what FERC account it is assigned to. The FERC Uniform System of Accounts classification. So when you look at a CPR unit, you know what it is, when it was placed into service, what the historical cost was, and how it should flow to the FERC Uniform System of Accounts on your general ledger. So when you look at this example of CPRs, you see we have things mixed up here a little bit just to show you on the same screen. But we have distribution poles that were installed in 2015, how many, what the unit cost is, the total cost, and the FERC account, as I just said. We also have class 2 40-foot poles that were installed in 2018. You see the cost for those, how many are left. The quantity is the number of survivors, so those that are still in service. We have an overhead conductor, which in practice, these would appear on separate pages because overhead conductor is assigned to account 365, and you see the year it was installed, how many feet, cost per foot. Transformers, same thing, year installed, quantity of survivors, unit cost, total cost, FERC account, and then underground cable, which goes to account 367, installed in 2020. And again, all of these would be on separate pages, but I wanted to give you a flavor of what these would look like as far as descriptive elements when it comes to the CPR. So you don't need a separate CPR for every individual pole. You just need the records that balance the accuracy with manageability, which is why when we follow the FERC standards, the RUS standards, it says average cost for all installed units for a particular year for items like poles, overhead conductor, transformers, and cable, and so on. So that brings us to the distinction, between compatible units and continuing property records. Again, compatible units are those detailed items and drawings that I was talking about that your engineering department uses to design projects. It's the design standard. They use them to plan and build projects. They're very detailed. In fact, one of the best resources you can have for compatible units are from the RUS, the Rural Utilities Service. They have thousands of fixed assets designed, different types of poles, configuration, same with wire and conduit, and so on. So a lot of engineering departments use those for the configuration of projects that they design. And again, these are driven by engineering needs. And then on the flip side, the CPRs, that's the accounting cost record used to track historical costs. So a lot more general in nature. You don't need to know every nut and bolt on a CPR that you do on a compatible unit. You couldn't build something with a CPR, but you can certainly account for it. And this is driven by the accounting needs. We don't need that necessary detail. And there does not need to be a one-to-one relationship between compatible units and CPRs. Like it says here, engineering can have 50 different pole specifications, but accounting is going to distill those down in maybe 5 or 10 continuing property record categories. The distinction there is you need the detail on the engineering side and less detail on the accounting side.